The church hall in Munich is emptying. Chairs scrape against the wood floor. Coats rustle. Somewhere near the back, a woman is gathering hymnals into a canvas bag, and the light coming through the tall windows has gone the color of weak tea, the particular gray gold of a German afternoon in 1947, 2 years after the war that broke the world in half. Corrie ten Boom stands near the front, a small, round-faced Dutch woman not yet 55, though the camps have aged her further than the calendar says they should. She has just finished speaking on forgiveness. She has told this room of shattered, hungry, war-scoured people that God casts their sin into the deepest sea and puts up a sign that says no fishing allowed. They have nodded. Some have wept. It is by now a message she has given dozens of times since her release from Ravensbrück, and she believes every word of it the way she believes the sun will come up. And then she sees him. He is working his way toward her through the thinning crowd, a stocky man in a gray overcoat, and there is nothing about his face that should mean anything to her. Germany in 1947 is full of stocky men in gray overcoats, men trying to become ordinary again, men who would like very much not to be recognized, but her body knows him before her mind has finished the sentence. It is the uniform that comes back first, not the coat he is wearing now, but the one he wore then, and the strap of a rifle, and the room at Ravensbrück where the women were made to walk past a row of guards, stripped of even the dignity of clothing, and this man had stood in that row and looked at them the way a man looks at something that is not quite human. She remembers her sister Betsy's shoulder blades. She remembers not being able to look at Betsy, because to look at Betsy in that room was a mercy Corrie could not afford to give her, and a cruelty she could not afford to receive. He is in front of her now. He is beaming, in fact. That is the detail that will stay with her longest, that he is happy to see her, that whatever has happened to him in the years between has left him with the sunny confidence of a man who believes good news is being delivered. "How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein," he says, "to think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." He puts out his hand. Everything in the room keeps moving, the woman with the hymnals, the last of the daylight, the ordinary business of a Tuesday afternoon in a broken city, and everything in Corrie stops. This is the second the whole rest of her life will turn on, though she does not yet know that. She only knows that a hand is in the air between them, waiting, and that her own hand has not moved to meet it, and that some clock she cannot see is ticking off the seconds of his patience. She does not, in this instant, forgive him. That has to be said plainly, because so much has been made soft and sentimental about this moment since, so much turned into a pious watercolor, that it is worth insisting on the truth of it. And the second the hand hangs in the air, Corrie ten Boom does not feel forgiveness. She feels the opposite. She feels the old, cold thing come up in her, that she had hoped the years and the sermons and the thousand retellings of Betsy's last words had burned out of her for good. It has not been burned out. It is right there, as fresh as the morning she watched this man's colleagues push her sister's wasted body onto a pile, as fresh as her own months of hunger and lice, and the particular grief of watching someone she loved more than her own life, dying by degrees in a bed with no sheet, in a barracks that stank of sickness, while women just like this one, men just like this one, walked past with clipboards and did nothing. She had preached, not 10 minutes before, that there is no pit so deep God's love is not deeper still. She had said it with her whole chest, and now the pit has a face and a gray overcoat and an outstretched hand, and it turns out to be a very different thing to preach the sermon than to live inside it. She has told this story many times in the years since, in Tramp for the Lord, in 100 meetings across 100 countries, to audiences who needed to hear that forgiveness is not a feeling that arrives like weather, but a discipline that must sometimes be forced, at gunpoint, out of an unwilling heart. And she has never once softened this part of it. She has never claimed that love simply flooded in and made the choice easy. She has said, instead, that she stood there and felt nothing but the wooden stiffness of her own arm, and that she prayed, not a long prayer, not an eloquent one, just the plain and desperate prayer of a woman who knows she cannot do what is being asked of her, and knows at the same time that she must. "Jesus, help me. I can lift my hand. That's all I can do. You supply the feeling." To understand why that prayer was even possible, why, standing in front of the very shape of her worst grief, she reached for help instead of reaching for the door, you have to go back through everything that made her, all the way back to a house on the Barteljorisstraat in Haarlem where a watchmaker named Casper ten Boom knelt every morning with his children and prayed for the peace of Jerusalem before he had even opened the shop. You have to go back to a girl learning to mend watch movements at her father's bench, and to a sister named Betsy whose lungs were never strong but whose faith never once flickered, not in the Beigie's warm kitchen and not, extraordinarily, in the freezing dark of Ravensbrück itself. You have to go back to the hiding place built into a wall of that house, the small brick and timber room where Jewish men and women crouched in silence while the boots of the Gestapo came up the stairs, and to the arrest that came anyway, in February of 1944, and to the cattle car and the barracks and the roll calls standing in the cold for hours while women collapsed around them. You have to go most of all to a bed in Ravensbrück in December of 1944, to a sister so reduced by cruelty and cold and dysentery that she could no longer stand, who nonetheless spent her last clear days planning the house they would build after the war for people who had been broken by the camps. A house with gardens, she said, and no barbed wire, only trees. Betsy, dying, telling Corrie that they must tell people what they had learned in that place, that there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still. Corrie has said that those words were not comfort in the moment. Comfort was not available to her in the moment. They were something more like a commission, a set of marching orders left behind by a dying commander, and Corrie carried them out of the camp the way a soldier carries a flag out of a lost battle, because someone has to, because the alternative is to let the whole thing have been for nothing. Betsy died on December 16, 1944, in a hospital ward at Ravensbrück, her body so light by then that when the guards finally moved it, it went as if it were nothing at all. 12 days later, through a clerical error Corrie has always called nothing less than the hand of God, she was released. Other women her age, in that same selection, were sent to the gas chamber the following week. She walked out of that camp carrying a message she had not asked for and could not refuse, and for the rest of her life, through Holland's post-war hunger, through the founding of that very rehabilitation home Betsy had dreamed of, through decades of travel to more than 60 countries, she gave that message away, over and over, to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it. But a message preached is not the same as a message lived, and Corrie has always insisted on that distinction, has never let her listeners round it off into something easier. She had said, in meeting after meeting across defeated Germany, that God forgives, that God forgets, that the sea of his forgetting has no bottom. She believed it, she had built a house on it. And here now, in a hall in Munich, with the afternoon light going thin, God had arranged, because that is exactly how she understood it, arranged for her to find out whether she believed it enough to put her own hand into the hand of the man who had stood guard over her sister's degradation. The hand is still there, he has not lowered it, he is still smiling the broad, hopeful smile of a man expecting to be told that everything is all right now, and there is something almost unbearable in that smile's innocence, and his evident belief that a debt this size could simply be waved away with a warm handshake in a church hall, when the currency of that debt was her sister's life. She knew, in that frozen second, exactly what forgiveness would cost her, because she had already tasted the cost of not forgiving. She has said, in later years, that those who were bitter, and there were many among the camp survivors whose bitterness never left them, whose lives narrowed and hardened around what had been done to them until the bitterness became the only room they lived in. Those who kept their wounds open, in her observation, remained invalids. Those who forgave, whatever the forgiveness cost them, were able to build something afterward. She had seen both outcomes with her own eyes in the faces of women she had known before the war and met again after it. She did not want the narrow room. She wanted, whatever it took, the wide one. But wanting it in principle, sitting in a chair thinking about it in the abstract, is an entirely different transaction from wanting it with a stranger's hand hanging in the air in front of you and your sister's face rising up behind your eyes. So she prayed the only prayer available to her. And she has always been careful, telling this story, to describe exactly what happened next in the plainest possible terms, because she wanted no one to mistake it for her own achievement. She raised her hand. It felt, she has said, like lifting a great weight, like moving a limb that had gone entirely to sleep. And then, and this is the part she has never been able to explain except by calling it what it was, the mercy of God arriving exactly on schedule and not 1 second before the current came. That is her word for it, current, as though her arm were a wire and something had been switched on at the far end of it. Warmth flooded from her shoulder down through her elbow into her palm, and by the time her hand closed around his, the coldness that had been sitting in her chest since she recognized his face was simply gone, replaced by something that felt, she said, almost like joy, a joy she had done nothing to produce and could take no credit for, a joy that arrived the instant the obedience was complete and not 1 moment sooner. I forgive you, brother, she said, with all my heart. They stood there a moment longer, her hand in his, And she has said that she has never known the love of God so intensely as she did in that handshake, not in any sermon she preached about it before or since, not in any of the 1,000 times she told the story afterward to make the point stick for someone else's benefit, but in that one instant when the theology stopped being a thing she taught and became, simply, the air she was standing in. It would be easy, and false, to end the story there, as though the handshake settled something once and for all, as though Corrie ten Boom walked out of that hall in Munich a woman for whom forgiveness had become effortless from that day forward. She never claimed that. She met, in the years afterward, other faces from the camps, other moments that asked the same impossible thing of her, and she has said plainly that the choice never got easier, only the willingness to make it. What changed in Munich was not her feelings, but her certainty, the settled, unshakable knowledge, driven home in her own body, that when God commands forgiveness, he also supplies it, that the obedience and the power to obey arrive together if a person will only lift the hand and let them. That is the whole of what this book means to hold before you, a woman standing in a hall with her arm in the air, deciding, before she felt anything, before it made any emotional sense at all, to obey. Everything that formed her, the watchmaker's daughter in the hidden room and the cattle car, and the sister who died, still planting a garden, had been leading her, without her knowledge, toward the ability to make exactly that choice in exactly that second. And everything that followed, the 60 countries, the audiences numbering in the millions, the honor Israel would give her 20 years later at Yad Vashem, naming her righteous among the nations for a war she had not yet finished fighting when she raised that hand. Everything followed from what happened in her body in that instant of obedience. She used to say, later in her life, that Jesus' victor was not a slogan she had chosen, but a fact she had been shown, and shown most clearly in exactly this kind of moment. Not in the easy hours, but in the ones where every human instinct pulled one way and grace pulled the other, and grace, given half a chance, always won. The hand she held out to a former Ravensbrück guard in a Munich church hall in 1947 was not, in the end, her own strength reaching toward reconciliation. It was obedience opening a door that God then walked through. To understand how a girl from a watchmaker's house on the Barteljoerstraat came to be standing in that doorway at all, we have to go back much further than Munich, back to Haarlem, back to the Beijing, back to a father on his knees every morning praying for a people not his own. The clocks began it every morning, before anyone's feet touched the floor. 100 of them, more some years, crowded on shelves and hung on walls in the narrow shop at the front of the house on Barteljoerstraat, each one keeping its own time until Casper ten Boom came down the twisting stair and set them right. He did this by ear as much as by eye, a tuning fork sometimes in his hand, head tilted like a man listening for something underneath the sound. By the time the shop door opened for the day's first customer, the ten Boom clocks agreed with each other and with the great tower clock of St. Bavois was a few streets away. It was a small thing, correcting 100 clocks before breakfast. It was also, without anyone remarking on it, a kind of sermon repeated every day of Corrie ten Boom's childhood, that order is a form of love, that the unseen hour matters enough to walk downstairs for, that faithfulness is mostly done in the dark before anyone is awake to notice. The house itself seemed built for exactly this kind of devotion. It was not really one house but two, an old merchant's home and the narrower building behind it, joined by a twisting connecting passage so tight that furniture had to be carried up sideways, and grown men learned to duck without thinking. The family called the whole crooked arrangement the Beige, and by whatever name, it was never spacious. Staircases climbed at odd angles, ceilings dropped low enough to graze a tall head. Everything smelled of oil and metal shavings from the shop below, and beeswax from the furniture, and on Sunday, of the good soup Tante kept simmering for whoever might come to the door hungry. 3 unmarried women lived there besides Casper and his children, his sisters-in-law and his own sister, women of strong opinion and stronger devotion, so that a visitor stepping into the Beige for the first time might have wondered how so many convictions fit into so few square meters. And yet it worked, because one man's yes ran through the whole house like a keel through a ship, holding everything else steady. That man was Casper ten Boom, and Haarlem had long since stopped thinking of him merely as a watchmaker. People called him the grand old man of Haarlem, not because he sought the title, but because it was simply true. Earned the slow way, one kindness at a time, over decades behind that shop counter. He had inherited the business from his own father, and would in time pass it to Corrie. But what he handed down was never only tools and inventory. He handed down a way of paying attention. Watchmaking, done properly, cannot be rushed or faked. A gear either meshes or it does not. A spring is either wound true, or it will fail its owner at the hour that matters most. Caspar taught his children to work this way not by lecturing them on discipline, but by letting them watch him do it, hour after hour, patient with a stubborn movement, the way he was patient with a stubborn customer, the way he was patient, later, with a stubborn century. He prayed the same way he worked, attentively, by name, without hurry. Every morning after breakfast and again after the evening meal, the family gathered around the table while Caspar opened the great Bible and read a chapter aloud, straight through, in the old sober cadence of the Dutch Reformed liturgy he had known since he was a boy. Then he prayed. He did not pray in generalities. He prayed for the Queen and for the government of the Netherlands, for the sick of the neighborhood by name, for missionaries whose photographs stood on the mantel, and, every single day, without fail, long before any regime in Berlin gave the habit new weight, he prayed for the peace of Jerusalem and for the Jewish people scattered across the earth, calling them by the phrase from the prophet Zechariah that he loved best, the apple of God's eye. A child raised in that room did not need a catechism to learn that God's covenant with Abraham's descendants was not history but a living fact, worthy of daily intercession. Corrie absorbed it the way she absorbed the smell of the shop, before she had words to explain what she knew. It was not only prayer. The house had Jewish friends in it the way other houses had family friends, rabbis who came to the shop to talk theology with Caspar over a cup of tea, merchants who supplied the parts for his watches, neighbors from the old Jewish quarter a few streets away, whom Caspar greeted by name and by hat tip on his walks through town. He read the Talmud alongside his Old Testament, curious and reverent, treating the wisdom of Israel as something a Christian owed respect rather than correction. When his children asked why he cared so much for people who did not share the family's faith in the Messiah, Caspar's answer was never complicated. These were God's own people, chosen before the world began, and to love them was simply to love what God loved. He did not know, saying this over tea in a quiet shop in the 1900s, that he was laying track for a train that would not arrive for 30 more years. He only knew it was true, and truth, in that house, was something you acted on before you understood its cost. The hands did as much teaching as the words. Corrie would remember, all her life, the particular feel of her father's fingers guiding hers around a tiny screw, the loop pressed to his eye, his voice low and unhurried as he showed her how to set a hairspring without breaking it. There is a way of teaching a child obedience that never once uses the word. Caspar taught it in the shop, correcting her grip without scolding, letting her feel the small satisfaction of a wheel turning true because she had been careful. He taught it on his long daily walks around Haarlem, when he stopped to help a stranger or press a coin into a beggar's palm without breaking his sentence, so that kindness looked to a watching daughter like something as natural as breathing, and he taught it, most memorably, on a train. Corrie was still young enough that the word had only just entered her hearing, some ugliness murmured by an older girl at school, a phrase Corrie herself only half understood, when she turned to her father on the ride home from Amsterdam and asked him, plainly, what it meant. Caspar did not answer at once. He reached instead for the heavy case he always carried, thick with tools and parts, and asked Corrie to lift it down from the rack. She tried and could not. It was far too heavy for her arms. Caspar only nodded, as if she had answered a different question than the one she had asked, and told her that some things were like that case, too heavy for a child to carry, not because the thing itself was shameful, but because a child's arms are not yet strong enough for its weight. When the time came that she could carry it, he said, he would give it to her, and not one day before. It was, on its surface, a small mercy about a hard subject, handled with more wisdom than most parents manage. But it was also, Corrie would come to understand only much later, the shape of every burden God ever asked her to carry. He does not hand a soul more than it can bear. He waits, as her father waited, until the arms are ready, and then he gives the weight, and by then, somehow, the strength has already arrived to meet it. That was the whole architecture of the house, if you could see it plainly, a father who gave nothing before its time, and withheld nothing once the time had come. It made for a childhood with real boundaries, and, inside those boundaries, an enormous freedom. The 10 Boom children were not indulged, but they were never left wondering whether they were loved. Caspar's affection had a physical, daily quality to it, a hand on the shoulder passing through a doorway, a story told at bedtime. Patience extended again and again to a household of strong-willed women who did not always agree with one another or with him. He absorbed disagreement the way he absorbed a difficult repair, without temper, working at it until it came right. Visitors to the Beji sometimes remarked that they had never seen a household with so little raised voice in it, given how many opinions were living under one narrow roof. And running beneath all of it, quietly, was the conviction that would only be tested once everything else had been stripped away, that obedience to God was not a subject for Sunday, confined to the pew at the great church a few streets over, but a practice for Tuesday morning in a watch shop, for a train ride home from Amsterdam, for the ordinary hours when no one important was watching. Caspar ten Boom did not raise his children to be heroes. He raised them to notice what was true, and then to act as though it were true, every day, in small enough doses that the practice became instinct. He could not have known, teaching Corrie to hold a hairspring steady, that he was training the same hands that would one day need to hold steady while building a secret room in the walls of that very house. He could not have known that the daily prayer for the peace of Jerusalem, murmured over breakfast for decades, was rehearsal for a love that would demand everything. But this is the pattern faith so often takes, and the Ten Boom household is one of the clearest pictures of it the church has ever been given. God does not usually announce the great tests in advance. He builds the house first. He sets the clocks right, morning after unremarkable morning, until the household runs on a rhythm so deep that no crisis, however sudden, can throw it off its foundation. He plants the love, for Scripture, for the Jewish people, for the God who keeps every promise he has ever made, years before there is any visible reason for it, so that when the reason finally arrives, the love is already old, already rooted, already strong enough to bear whatever is asked of it. Caspar ten Boom never preached a sermon from a pulpit in his life. He preached one instead from behind a watchmaker's bench, in the family table, every single day, in a house so narrow 2 people could barely pass on the stair. And the sermon he preached, without ever saying so directly, was this: say yes to God in the small hour, and you will find, when the great hour comes, that the yes was already there waiting for you, worn smooth and strong by every ordinary day that came before it. Corrie did not know, growing up in those rooms, what shape her own yes would eventually take. She only knew the smell of oil and beeswax, the sound of her father's voice moving through a psalm at the evening table, the particular gentleness of hands that had never once, in all her childhood, handed her more than she could carry. It was an unremarkable way to raise a child, by the standards of the world. It would prove, within a few decades, to be exactly the preparation a soul would need for the darkest room in the house, and for the far darker rooms still waiting for her beyond it. The loop fit into the socket of her right eye the way it had for 30 years, and under its round lens the balance wheel of Mrs. Renzema's old pendant watch spun and slowed, a heartbeat in brass no bigger than a guilder. Corrie ten Boom held the tweezers steady, breathed out, and set the hairspring back into its cradle with a touch so light, the watch might have believed nothing had happened to it at all. Behind her, on the shelves that ran to the ceiling of the shop on the Barteljaarstraat, clocks she had wound herself that morning ticked in 100 different tempos, and beneath all of them, if you listened past the noise, was the one steady sound of her father's chair creaking as Caspar ten Boom bent over his own bench, doing what 10 Booms had done in that shop since before Napoleon walked through Harlem. It would be easy to skip past these years, to hurry from the girl who wept over a soldier's uniform in the front hall, to the woman who hid strangers behind a false wall, as though nothing filled the space between. But God does not build a hiding place, or a hider, in a single afternoon. He builds them the way Corrie built a watch, spring by spring, in the dark, where no one is watching, until the whole mechanism can be trusted to keep time when everything around it is stopped. Caspar ten Boom had begun teaching his daughter the trade almost as soon as she could hold a screwdriver without dropping it, not because he expected her to need it, but because a ten Boom did not sit idle while there was work in the shop. Corrie was clumsy at first, she said so herself, later laughing at the memory, dropping mainsprings that uncoiled across the floor like startled snakes, losing tiny screws into the seams of the workbench where they vanished forever. But she had her father's patience for small, invisible labor, and something else besides, a hunger to be useful that no one in that house ever had to manufacture in her. She wanted, from girlhood, to matter to somebody. The bench gave her a way to matter to everybody who walked through the door with a broken thing in their pocket. By the early 1920s she had trained formally, in Harlem first, and then abroad, taking instruction wherever a master would have her, and in 1924 she sat for the examination that made her the first woman in Holland to be awarded a watchmaker's license. It is worth pausing on that fact rather than rushing past it as a footnote to the more famous years ahead. In 1924 the guilds of the Netherlands did not imagine that a woman's hands belonged among gear trains and jewel bearings. Corrie ten Boom did not argue the point in speeches. She simply did the work better than the objection could survive. She sat the examiner's bench, opened the movement they set in front of her, diagnosed what was wrong, and repaired it. There was no way to fail her that did not also mean failing the watch, ticking true again under her fingers. It changed nothing about how she lived, and everything about what she was capable of. The shop stayed the same small crowded room smelling of oil and brass polish. Customers still came in complaining about the price of a mainspring. But something had been proven that would matter later, in ways nobody in that room could have guessed. That Cornelia ten Boom could be trusted with delicate, hidden, exacting work, that she would not panic when a mechanism resisted her, that she had the temperament to sit for hours over something small and easily ruined, coaxing it back toward wholeness rather than forcing it. The Camps would ask that same patience of her one day, applied to something far more precious than a watch. But the patience itself was forged here, on ordinary Tuesdays, for ordinary neighbors, for no reward greater than a few coins and Casper's quiet nod across the room. She did not confine that patience to the shop. Harlem in those years had streets the tourist never saw, narrow, damp courts behind the pretty gabled fronts, where families of 6 and 7 crowded into 2 rooms, and the children went to school in shoes stuffed with newspaper. Corrie had grown up seeing those streets, because Casper ten Boom had never let his children pretend they weren't there. And so, in her spare hours a woman running a shop and keeping a household with her sister Betsy might reasonably have claimed as her own, Corrie began gathering the daughters of those courts into clubs. They were not grand undertakings. She rented what rooms she could, borrowed chairs, and taught the girls of Harlem's poorer streets to sew, to sing, to recite, to pray, to stand up straighter than the world had told them they were allowed to stand. She organized what amounted to Holland's first Christian Girls' Club movement, long before such things had a name or an office or a budget, years before Girl Guides or church youth programs made this kind of work respectable and ordinary. Corrie built it out of nothing but her own evenings, and a conviction that every girl in Harlem, however poor, however plain, however overlooked by a city that had already decided what she would amount to, was worth an hour of somebody's full attention. That conviction did not stop at the ordinary girls. It went further, to the ones the ordinary clubs would not take. There were girls in Harlem, and in every Dutch town, whom the schools had given up on, whom the churches found awkward to seat, whom families sometimes kept out of sight rather than explained to neighbors. Girls with minds that worked more slowly, or differently, or not at all in the ways the test demanded. The word the era used for them was harsh, clinical, final, the kind of word that closes a door rather than opening one. Corrie ten Boom heard that word and went looking for the door anyway. She started clubs for these girls too, meeting weekly in whatever space she could arrange, and she ran them not as charity performed at arm's length, but as friendship offered without condition. She taught them calisthenics in the aisles between chairs, simple exercises that gave awkward bodies something to be proud of. She taught them Bible stories not simplified into condescension, but told with all the color and drama the stories actually contained, because she believed, she said this plainly, more than once, in the years she spoke of it afterward, that a mind the world called slow was no less hungry for the living God than a mind the world called brilliant. She organized games, she organized singing. She made a great deal of noise and a great deal of joy in rooms that Harlem's respectable society had quietly agreed to stop thinking about. It cost her nothing that could be entered in a ledger, and it cost her a great deal that could not. Evenings, sleep, the easier version of a life she might have had, keeping shop by day and resting by night like anyone else. She did not do it because she had spare time in abundance. A woman minding a business in a household rarely does. She did it because she had decided, long before, that a life was not measured by what it kept for itself. Ask what any of this has to do with a hiding place built into a wall, with ration cards forged at a kitchen table, with 6 people in their breath held still while jackboots search a house, and the honest answer is everything. Consider what those decades actually trained in her. Precision under pressure, the watchmaker's discipline of not letting the hand shake when the smallest mistake ruins the whole mechanism. Organizing groups of people toward a purpose, quietly, without official sanction, using rented rooms and borrowed chairs and whatever resources a modest household could spare, which is exactly the skill required, a decade later, to run an underground operation feeding and hiding refugees on a black market she had to learn from nothing. Patience with the slow, the difficult, the overlooked, because the people she would later hide were not, to the world outside, cases worth the risk. They were an old man too frail to travel, a mother with an infant who would not stop crying, a stranger with no papers and no proof of anything except his need. Corrie had spent 20 years learning to see worth in exactly the people society had stopped counting. When the Nazis began sorting Dutch Jews, the same way the schools had once sorted her disabled girls, into categories of who mattered and who did not, she already knew, in her hands and not only in her head, that the sorting was a lie. And there is this, too, which the record makes plain, and which deserves saying without embarrassment. When the German occupation began issuing its own orders about clubs and organizations, demanding registration, demanding lists of members, making clear that Jewish children would no longer be welcome in any group that wished to continue meeting, Corrie ten Boom did not comply. She had built those clubs for 20 years. She disbanded every one of them, rather than hand over a single name, rather than turn away a single child at a door she had spent 2 decades holding open. It was, in miniature, the same decision the Beige would make on a larger scale within the year. She had been rehearsing it the whole time, without knowing the size of the stage she was rehearsing for. There is a picture worth holding in the mind here, because it says more than any summary could. A woman not yet 50, hair going gray at the temples, sitting on a low chair in a rented hall, with a circle of girls around her. Girls other clubs wouldn't seat. Girls whose mothers had stopped hoping anyone would want them for an hour a week. Leading them through a song, with motions, clapping, when a girl who rarely managed the rhythm managed it that evening. Praising her the way you would praise a discovery. That same pair of hands, a decade later, would fit a length of pipe behind a false wall in a bedroom upstairs from the shop, would learn to read a coded knock, would tuck ration cards into a hollow stare. Nothing about the hands changed. Only the danger around them grew larger, and the hands, because they had spent 20 years learning not to shake over small and unglamorous things, did not shake now over large ones. Betsy was there through all of it, too, quieter, frailer, keeping the house running while Corrie kept the shop and the clubs, and it would be a mistake to imagine the sisters as separate engines pulling in different directions. Betsy's gentleness and Corrie's practical drive were 2 halves of the same faith, worked out in 2 different registers, under the same roof, at the same father's table. But this chapter belongs to Corrie's hands specifically, to what the watch bench and the girls' clubs built in her, year after uncelebrated year, while nothing about the wider world suggested any of it would ever matter beyond Harlem's own narrow streets. No one watching her in 1930 could have told you why any of it mattered. A woman fixing watches, a woman running clubs for factory girls and slow-minded children in borrowed rooms nobody important ever visited. It looked, to any reasonable observer, like a modest life, faithfully lived and safely small. That is very often how God trains the hands he intends to use for something enormous, quietly, in rooms nobody is watching, on people the world has already stopped counting, until the day arrives when the whole of that training is called on at once, and the person discovers, to her own astonishment, that she has already been prepared. Corrie ten Boom did not know, bent over Mrs. Rinzema's watch that afternoon with the loop pressed to her eye, what she was being prepared for. She only knew the balance wheel needed to spin true, and that it was hers to make it so. Every watch on every shelf in that shop, every girl in every rented hall across Harlem, was, without her ever naming it this way, an apprenticeship in fixing what was broken and loving what was overlooked. The world would soon hand her something far more broken than a pendant watch, and far more overlooked than a slow child in a backstreet courtyard. It would hand her a nation's worth of the hunted and the hidden, and she would go to that work with the same steady hands, because those hands had already spent 20 faithful years learning exactly what they were for. The bricks came up from the cellar 2 and 3 at a time, carried by a man named Mr. Metzelar, which was not really his name at all. It was the Dutch word for bricklayer, and it was the only name the ten Booms ever used for him, because what he was building was the kind of thing you did not want traced back to a person. He worked in Corrie's bedroom, on the 3rd floor of the Beige, in the last months of 1943, fitting a false wall 18 inches in front of the real one. When he was done, the room behind it was 30 inches deep and about 8 feet long, barely a closet, big enough for 6 people to stand pressed together, breathing carefully, waiting for a word that meant the danger had passed. It is easy, 70 years later, to say the sentence, "The 10 Booms built a hiding place," and move on, the way you'd note that a family added a porch. It was not that. Every inch of it was a decision made under threat of death. Not metaphorical death, not someday death, but the kind that came from the Gestapo of Harlem, who by the winter of 1943 had already emptied whole streets of Jewish families and shipped them east. Every brick Mr. Metzelar laid was a brick laid against that machine, and the machine everyone in that house understood would eventually come looking. It had not started with a room. It had started as the ordinary obediences of the Ten Boom family always started, with a knock. A Jewish woman appeared at the shop not long after the German invasion of May 1940, a suitcase in her hand, asking timidly whether the Ten Booms might know somewhere she could go. Her own family had turned her away, afraid of what harboring her would cost them. Caspar Ten Boom did not hesitate. In this household, he told her, God's people are always welcome. That single sentence, spoken in an old man's watch shop on the Barthel-Joris-Straat, was the seed of everything that followed. Within weeks, the Beige was sheltering not one but several refugees at a time, some staying an afternoon while safer arrangements were found, some staying for months. Corrie's brother Willem, a pastor who ran a nursing home for the elderly on the outskirts of Hilversum, was already moving Jewish refugees through his own network. He brought the family into contact with a wider underground of forgers, couriers, and safe houses springing up across the occupied Netherlands. The Ten Booms did not go looking for this work. It came and found them, the way trouble always found its way to a door that was known to open. By 1943, the traffic through the Beige had grown too heavy and too visible for an ordinary house to hide. Jewish men and women arrived at all hours, sometimes with warning, sometimes with none, needing food, false papers, a bed for a night or a year, and above all, a place to vanish the moment the doorbell of the shop rang in the particular way that meant trouble. The family had already been improvising: a loose floorboard, a gap behind a wardrobe, a signal, a triangular wooden alarm box wired to a buzzer, installed by the Haarlem Underground, that could be triggered from the shop below and heard on every floor of the house in under a second. But improvisation was not enough anymore. Caspar was 70 years old. Betsy, delicate all her life, could not run, and the refugees themselves, often older, often unused to danger, could not be expected to disappear in 90 seconds using nothing but a good idea. They needed an actual room, a place built for exactly one purpose, to not be found, so Mr. Metzelar came and built it in Corrie's own bedroom, behind a bookcase that swung out on a hidden hinge, low enough to the floor that a person had to duck and roll sideways to get through the gap at its base. Inside, there was room for a few chairs, a shelf, a chamber pot for the long hours, a bottle of water. No window, no sound. When the false wall was finished and painted to match the true one behind it, Mr. Metzelar himself could not find it in the dark, and he had built it. Then came the part that mattered as much as the bricks, the drilling. Corrie Ten Boom, who by every account of those who lived through it became the true commander of this operation despite never asking for the title, ran timed drills with the whole household, family and refugees both, the way an army runs drills before a battle it knows is coming. The alarm would sound without warning, at breakfast, at midnight, in the middle of a meal, and every person in that house, whatever their age or fear, had 70 seconds to reach the 3rd floor, fold themselves into that space behind the bookcase, and go silent. 70 seconds became the standard because Corrie had measured more than once how long it took the Gestapo to climb from a stopped car to a 3rd-floor bedroom once they were inside the front door. The drills were not theater. They were the only thing standing between a family of refugees and a train to the east, and Corrie ran them with the discipline of someone who understood exactly what failure would cost. The room held, over those months, a rotating cast of the hidden. There was Mary Atali, a young Jewish woman who had lost her whole family already, and who found in Betsy something like a second mother. There was Meta Monsanto. There was a man the household called Jussi Meyermassel, a cantor from Amsterdam, whose real name was too dangerous to speak aloud even inside the walls of the Beige. A big, warm, funny man who insisted, over Caspar's mild objections, on leading evening devotions with a booming confidence that filled the whole house with something that felt, against all reason, like joy. There were others whose names have not survived in the record because names were the first thing the underground taught you to be careful with. What is certain is that the Beige, through the darkest years of the occupation, sheltered Jewish refugees in a continuous, rolling company, never fewer than 2 or 3 at a time hidden somewhere in the house, and often as many as 6 or 7, alongside underground workers passing through, ration card couriers, and the ordinary customers who still came in the front of the shop to have their watches fixed, never guessing what breathed behind the walls above their heads. Ration cards were their own battle. A family cannot feed refugees on ration cards issued to a family. The numbers give it away instantly to anyone who checks. So Corrie became, in the words later used by those who worked beside her, something like the queen of an underground kitchen. She coordinated with a resistance ration card thief who supplied extra cards each month, sometimes at great personal risk to himself, and she kept the books of who ate what and where with the same meticulous, cheerful precision her father had once brought to a broken watch. She learned to lie to German officials with a straight face when the family's ration allotment was questioned. She learned which shopkeepers in Harlem could be trusted with an odd request and which could not. None of this came naturally to a 50-year-old spinster who had spent most of her life teaching Sunday school and running a girls' club. It came because it had to, because the room behind the wall was only as safe as the operation that fed and clothed and hid the people inside it, and somebody had to run that operation, and that somebody, more and more, was Corrie. It is worth pausing on what kind of household this made the Beige. By day the shop below still opened at the same hour it always had, still smelled of oil and brass, still rang its small cheerful bell when a customer came to collect a watch. By night the house above became something closer to a small silent city, refugees moving quietly between rooms, underground workers arriving with papers to be hidden, Casper still holding his family devotions each morning at the same table where the family had always gathered, reading the same scriptures, only now with a Jewish cantor's voice sometimes joining in the Psalms. Danger and ordinary life ran side by side in that house for nearly 2 years, and what held them together, everyone who was there afterward agreed, was Casper's unshaken conviction that this was simply what obedience to God looked like now, not a special calling requiring some rare courage, but the same courage that had always been asked of him, only turned up to its full volume. It came apart on the 28th of February, 1944, a Monday. The betrayal, when it came cheaply, the way betrayal almost always does. A Dutchman named Jan Vogel, working as an informer for the Gestapo, walked into the shop that morning and asked for Corrie by name, claiming he needed help for 6 Jews hiding at his own address. It was a trap, and by the time the shop bell rang again that afternoon, it was not customers who came through the door, but the Gestapo itself, in strength, moving fast up the narrow stairs of the Beige toward the 3rd floor. The alarm sounded. 6 people, refugees who had been living in the house that week, scrambled for the bookcase and the space behind it. The drill that had been run so many times finally called upon in earnest. It did not go as smoothly as the practice runs. Corrie herself was in bed, ill with the flu, when the buzzer went off, and she had to move refugees into the hiding place from a sick bed, her body slow with fever, while her mind raced against the 70 seconds she had drilled into everyone else 100 times. They made it. Every one of the 6 who went into that room that afternoon went in undetected, and the false wall closed behind them, and Mr. Metzlar's careful brickwork did exactly what it had been built to do. The Gestapo did not find them. They searched the house for hours, tearing through closets, pulling up floorboards, questioning the family one by one, and they did not find the room, because the room, by its whole design, was built to survive a search exactly like this one. But they found everything else. They found Casper, 76 years old, at his workbench. They found Betsy. They found Corrie, still half delirious with fever, and arrested her along with the rest of the household present that day. Some 35 people in total were swept up in the raid, family and underground contacts and chance visitors alike, nearly all of Harlem's resistance network, touched by that single afternoon. Casper's response to his arrest is one of the moments the family would return to for the rest of their lives. An officer, perhaps out of some flicker of respect for the old man's age, offered to let him die at home rather than in custody if he would simply promise to cause no more trouble. Casper's answer, given without a trace of fear, was that if he were sent home today, he would open his door to anyone who knocked in need tomorrow. There was no bargaining in him, no fear that could be traded against his obedience. He was taken to Scheveningen prison and died there 10 days later, on the 9th of March, alone among strangers, his last recorded words a testimony that he had not been ashamed for 1 hour of what his family had done. The 6 refugees stayed hidden in that 30-inch room for nearly 2 full days after the raid, without water for stretches of it, without knowing whether the house above them was still occupied by the family who loved them, or by the men who had come to destroy them. It was the Harlem Underground, working through the terrifying silence of those 2 days, that finally reached them and moved them, one by one, out through a hole broken into the wall by a police officer sympathetic to the resistance, to new hiding places across the city. Every one of the 6 who entered that room on the 28th of February, 1944, survived the war. The room did exactly what it was built to do, on the one day it was ever truly tested, and it did not fail. That is the strange double truth of that February morning, and it does not resolve easily, and it should not be made to. The hiding place worked. The family that built it did not go free. Casper ten Boom, whose one sentence to a frightened Jewish woman had started all of it, died in a prison cell for the crime of believing his own door belonged to God rather than to himself. Corrie and Betsy were taken from the Beige that same day and would not see Harlem again for the better part of a year, and by the time Corrie did see it again, Betsy would not be with her. The small obedience of a decade, The yes given quietly, over and over, to whoever knocked, had become, on one ordinary Monday, one enormous obedience, paid for at the full and terrible price such obedience sometimes asks. The room behind the wall held. What it cost to build it, and what it cost to keep it standing, was the rest of the family's freedom, and for one gentle old watchmaker, the rest of his life. The train from Vogt took 3 days, though no one could have said afterward how long it truly was, because time in a cattle car with no light and no water stops being measured in hours. When the doors finally opened at Ravensbrück, the women fell out into September dust, and the first thing Corrie noticed, even before the shouting began, was the smell, smoke, sweet and terrible, hanging low over a place that had no gardens, no trees, nothing green at all. They were made to strip. Every woman, every possession, every scrap of clothing taken and searched and thrown into a pile, guards moving down the lines with the flat efficiency of people who had done this 10,000 times before. Corrie stood in that line with a small blue cloth bag hanging from a string around her neck, and inside it was her Bible, the one she and Betsy had carried out of the beige wrapped against her back, the one that had survived Scheveningen and Vogt, hidden in a bread bag, in a coat hem, in whatever crease of fabric would take it. She had promised herself, watching the pile of confiscated Bibles and photographs and wedding rings grow at the front of the line, that this one would not go on it. She bowed her head as if in prayer, which she was, and asked, simply, "Hide it." Not clever plans, not a strategy, just the same prayer she had prayed 100 times in the hidden room at home, addressed to the same God who had never yet failed to answer it. When it came her turn, the matron's hands moved over her, rough and quick, patting down arms, waist, legs, and passed straight over the bag at her throat, as though it were not there at all. Betsy, behind her, felt the same hands find nothing. Neither woman could explain it later, except to say that it was not their doing. They were marched, naked, into a shower room, issued thin dresses and wooden shoes, and assigned to Barracks 28, a long, low building meant to hold 400 women and holding, that autumn, closer to 1,400. The straw mattresses were stacked 3 high and crawling with vermin. The air did not move, and it was here, on the first night, unpacking nothing because there was nothing to unpack, that Betsy opened her hand and showed Corrie what she had carried through the search, hidden in her dress, a small bottle of vitamin drops, de Vitamin, meant for the weakest women in the barracks, the ones already failing. Betsy held that bottle the way she held everything, as if it belonged to God, and she had simply been asked to carry it a while. Each morning she measured out a few drops for whichever woman seemed nearest collapse. It should have emptied within a week. 2 women needing it became 6, then a dozen, then women from other blocks who had heard there was a Dutch woman with medicine, though it was barely medicine at all, just a thin brown liquid in whatever faith Betsy poured into the giving of it. Corrie counted the days in her head, waiting for the bottle to run dry, doing the arithmetic of drops against weeks and coming up short every time. It did not run dry. Week after week the bottle that should have been empty by October was still yielding drops in December, and Corrie, who loved God and doubted anyway because she was human, finally asked Betsy outright whether she oughtn't to measure more carefully, to make it stretch, to plan for the day it failed. Betsy only said that she had stopped counting. She trusted the giver, not the bottle. And then one evening a fellow prisoner, moved by pity, pressed a fresh bottle of drops into Betsy's hand from a package she had received. And that same week, without explanation, the old bottle, the one that had defied every calculation for 2 months, ran dry at last, exactly when it was no longer needed and not one day before. Corrie would tell that story for the rest of her life, in 100 countries, to audiences who had never known hunger or cold, because it taught her something she never forgot, that God's supply is measured to the need, not to the fear that the need might grow. The fleas in Barracks 28 were beyond anything Corrie had known even at Vogt. They rose off the mattresses in clouds, bit through the thin dresses, kept every woman scratching through the sleepless nights. When Corrie discovered them on that first evening she said so, plainly, with the disgust anyone would feel. And Betsy, who had just finished reading aloud the 5th chapter of 1 Thessalonians by the last grey light through the barracks window, "In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you," said that they should thank God for the fleas too. Corrie could not do it. She said as much. There was a line, she thought, and fleas were surely past it. But Betsy insisted, gently and without argument, the way she always insisted on things she was certain of, and so they thanked God for the fleas along with everything else, because Betsy had asked it, and because the verse did not say some circumstances, it said all. It was weeks later that they understood why. Every evening, once the guards had done their count and gone, the women of Barracks 28 gathered in the crowded dark to hear Corrie read from the smuggled Bible, a verse translated softly from Dutch into French, into Polish, into Russian, whispered down the tiers of bunks in a dozen tongues at once, until the words of the Gospel of John were moving through that barracks like a current no one could see. Women who had lost husbands, children, entire villages, leaned in to hear that light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It should have been impossible. Such a gathering, such an open violation, would have meant the discovery of the Bible and the end of everything. But the guards would not come into Barracks 28. Not once, the whole time Corrie and Betsy were there. It took Betsy's clear eye to see why. The fleas that overran that barracks kept even the guards out. The very thing Corrie had refused to be thankful for was what let the word of God move freely among 1,400 women in the middle of the most closely watched place on earth. Betsy called it what it was, not luck, not the accident of an infested building, but the deliberate kindness of a God who had already thought of the fleas before Corrie ever complained of them. She had a way of seeing the whole cloth when Corrie could see only the dark thread in front of her, and she never tired of turning Corrie's eyes toward the pattern. She had another habit that unsettled Corrie at first, and comforted her later. She spoke of the future as though it were already decided, already gentle, and already theirs to build. Even in that barracks, with women dying of typhus in the next tier of bunks, and the smoke from the crematorium visible through gaps in the boards, Betsy described a house she could see clearly in her mind, a large house, with big rooms and gleaming floors, with gardens outside the windows, where the people broken by the war, on both sides of it, the hunted and even those who had done the hunting, could come and be healed. She spoke of it not as a wish but as a plan, describing the wood of the floors, the light through the windows, as if she had already walked through the rooms. Corrie listened and loved her sister, and could not, in that place, imagine that either of them would live to see any house at all again. By December, Betsy could barely walk. The years of hard labor, the cold, the starvation rations, had done to her frail body what Corrie had feared since Scheveningen. She was moved to the hospital barracks, and Corrie, breaking every rule that could be broken, found ways to be near her, bribing an orderly, slipping through at the change of guard, sitting on the floor beside her sister's bunk in the freezing dark. Betsy's back had become so covered with wounds from the beatings and the hard labor that she could no longer lie flat. Still, in whatever position she could manage, she went on talking, and what she talked about, in those last days, was not her pain, which must have been considerable, but the mission the two of them still had ahead, as though the barracks around her were merely a delay before the real work began. She told Corrie, more than once in those final days, that they must tell people what they had learned here, that there was no pit so deep that God was not deeper still. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without drama, as a fact she had tested and found true. She had tested it in Barracks 28, in the fleas and the fear and the smell of smoke on the wind, and she had found that even there, even in that place built to strip every last shred of dignity and hope from the women inside it, God had not been absent. He had been present in the vitamin drops that would not run dry, and the Bible the searching hands could not find, and the fleas that kept the guards away from the one thing that mattered most. If he could be found there, Betsy reasoned, he could be found anywhere, by anyone, in any pit a human being could fall into, and that truth, she told Corrie, was worth more than either of their lives, and must not die with them in that barracks. On the morning of December 16th, 1944, Corrie found her sister's bunk already surrounded. Betsy had died in the night, and when Corrie was allowed, briefly, to see her before the body was taken away, she found on Betsy's face not the gauntness and suffering that had marked her final weeks, but something else entirely, a peace, almost a youthfulness, as if whatever pain had lived in that body had simply been lifted off it the moment she left. The nurses who prepared the bodies at Ravensbrück saw thousands of them, and had grown past being moved by any of them. Several stopped, that morning, to look at Betsy's face and remark on it, unprompted, to Corrie, as though they too could see that something had happened there beyond the ordinary business of dying. Corrie stood by that bunk and understood, with a clarity that would carry her through everything that followed, that the dark had done everything in its power in that place, starved bodies, worked them past bearing, taken husbands and homes and names and dignity, and had still not managed to reach the one thing it most wanted to destroy. It had not touched Betsy's certainty. It had not touched the vision of the house with the wide windows. It had not touched the truth that no pit was too deep. Whatever Ravensbrück had been built to accomplish in the souls of the women who passed through it, it had failed in Betsy ten Boom, failed completely, and Corrie bereft, alone now, in a way she had never been alone in her life, without the sister who had never once let go of her hand since the night they were arrested, understood that failure to be a kind of victory too large to hold by herself, she would carry that vision out of Ravensbrück, Though she did not yet know how or when she would leave it, she would carry the memory of the vitamin bottle and the fleas and the whispered gospel of John moving down the tiers of bunks in 6 languages, and she would carry, most of all, the sentence Betsy had given her as a kind of inheritance, spoken not once but many times in those last weeks, until it had settled into Corrie the way a seed settles into ground it will not leave again, that there is no pit so deep that he is not deeper still. It was the whole of what they had learned in that place, distilled down to a single line simple enough for a child to understand, and sturdy enough to hold the weight of everything Corrie ten Boom would go on to tell the world for the next 33 years. The barracks did not know, that December morning, what it had failed to destroy. But Corrie knew, and she carried it forward, out of Ravensbrück and out past every dark place she would ever be asked to stand in again, because her sister had proven, with her whole broken and shining life, that the dark could reach a body, could reach a heartbeat, could even reach the last hour of a woman's earthly days, but it could not reach the thing underneath. Not that. Never that. The line moved forward one woman at a time, and Corrie stood in it, with her coat pulled tight over legs so swollen with edema that her skin had begun to split at the ankles. A clerk sat at a table checking papers against a list, waving some women left, some right, and when he came to Corrie's name he paused, frowned, checked something twice, and then stamped her release without looking up. She would learn later that it was a mistake, a clerical error, nothing more, some mismatched form or misfiled card in a bureaucracy that processed the deaths of thousands of women a week and could not always be bothered to get the living ones right. On December 28, 1944, Corrie ten Boom walked out through the gates of Ravensbrück, a free woman, 12 days after Betsy had died on a stretcher in the camp hospital, with a smile still settling on her face. She did not learn the rest of the story until later, and when she did it, emptied her out and filled her up in the same breath. The women of her age group, the ones who had stood beside her at roll call in the grey dawns while the loudspeakers screamed numbers into the cold, every one of them was sent to the gas chamber the week after Corrie's release. A week. She had walked out through a door that closed behind her like a blade coming down, and on the other side of that door were women she had prayed with, women whose names she knew, women who did not get the mistake that she got. There is no answer to why one woman is chosen and another is not. Corrie never pretended to have found one. She only said, again and again for the rest of her life, that she did not walk out of that camp because she deserved to. She walked out because God still had work for her hands, and the work was not yet finished. The journey home took the better part of 2 weeks, and nearly killed her by inches. She rode trains crowded with refugees and soldiers through a Germany beginning to buckle under Allied bombing, sleeping sitting up, her legs so swollen she could not bend them, fed by strangers who saw a starving woman in a camp coat and understood without being told what she had come from. At one station a nurse looked at her ankles and admitted her to a hospital in Groningen rather than let her travel another mile in that condition, and Corrie lay in a clean bed under clean sheets for the first time in 10 months and could not stop shaking. It was not relief. It was the body catching up to what the mind had not yet let itself feel. Betsy was dead. Betsy, who had held her hand through the fleas and the beatings and the endless counting, who had seen gardens and homes and a whole shape of ministry rising up out of the ash of Ravensbrück, who had said with her last labored breath that there was no pit so deep God was not deeper still, Betsy would not be coming home to see any of it. Corrie would carry that vision alone, or she would not carry it at all. She came home to Haarlem in January, to a house that no longer had the shape it once had. Caspar was gone, dead within days of the arrest, an old man's heart giving out under the strain of a prison cell, spared at least the horror of the camps his daughters had endured. The beige stood on Barteljorenstraat exactly as it had always stood, the shop bell still hung on its bracket, the crooked stairs still narrow, but the people who had made it a home were scattered into graves in memory. Corrie walked through those rooms in the weeks after her return, and felt the absence of every voice that used to fill them. And there were nights, she admitted later, when the grief weighed heavier than anything the camp had asked her to carry, because in the camp she had at least had Betsy beside her to help hold it up. What she did not do, and this matters, because it is so easy for the record to skip past the wreckage on its way to the glory, was rise from that grief in a single triumphant motion, the woman who would go on to speak in 60 countries, who would stand before crowned heads and prison inmates and packed cathedrals with the same message on her lips, spent months first simply trying to learn how to sleep again, how to eat a full meal, how to walk down a street without flinching at the sound of boots. She was thin as a wire and haunted by dreams. She wept without warning. The war in Europe was not even over yet. It would grind on through the spring of 1945, and Corrie, safe now inside her own walls, had to sit with the fact that Betsy was not safe, was not anywhere, was ash in memory, and a promise not yet fulfilled. The promise was the thing that finally moved her. Betsy had said it plainly in the camp, in the last conscious days before the fever took her. They must tell people what they had learned, that there was no pit so deep God was not deeper still, and that after the war they would need a house with gardens. Betsy had seen it clearly, gardens instead of barbed wire, where people broken by what had happened to them could come and slowly become whole. Corrie could have let that vision die quietly with her sister. Instead, in the months that followed, she found herself doing something she never planned and could barely explain. She began to talk about it, first to a few people in Harlem, then to a church group, then to strangers who heard she had survived Ravensbrück and wanted to know what she had seen there. Each time she spoke, something in her lifted a little, as though the telling itself were part of the healing Betsy had promised. She was 52 years old, unmarried, without a trade beyond watchmaking, without money, without a plan, and she began, almost without deciding to become someone who spoke for a living, if living was even the word for it, since for years there would be no salary and no security behind it at all. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen easily. There is a temptation, telling this story, to make the transformation instant, camp to platform, grief to glory, in one clean page. That is not how Corrie herself told it. She wrestled for a long while with whether she had the right to speak, whether her German was good enough, whether anyone wanted to hear an old Dutch spinster talk about a concentration camp when the whole world was trying to forget the war as fast as it could. She wrestled, too, with simple practicalities, who would run the watch shop, where she would sleep, how she would eat. But invitation followed invitation, first inside Holland, then across the border into Germany itself, of all places, and each door that opened felt to her like Betsy's hand still pushing from somewhere she could not see. In time she gave up the shop altogether, gave up the settled Harlem life the Bijou had always represented, and stepped into what she came to call, without any bitterness at all, being a tramp for the Lord, homeless by design, carrying one suitcase, going wherever the invitations led, sleeping in whatever bed was offered, trusting that the God who had kept her alive in Ravensbrück for a reason would keep providing the reason as she went. It was in that early traveling ministry, in 1947, in a church in Munich, that the conviction she carried about forgiveness stopped being a doctrine and became a wound she had to let God close with her own hands. She had been speaking that evening on the forgiveness of God, how sins could be dropped into the deepest sea, how a Christian was not asked merely to feel forgiveness, but to grant it as an act, whatever the cost. The Germans in the pews that night were not strangers to what she was describing. Many of them had lived through the bombing of their own cities, had lost sons and husbands, and some of them, she knew without being able to prove it of any one face, had worn a different uniform not so many years before, and done things they could not undo. She finished speaking, and the congregation began to file out. And that was when she saw him, a stocky man in a gray overcoat, working his way toward her through the departing crowd with his hat in his hand, and something in the shape of his face closed around her chest like a fist before her mind had even placed him. He had been a guard at Ravensbrück. Not any guard, one of the ones stationed at the processing room where new arrivals were made to strip and walk past a line of leering men. The very room where Corrie and Betsy had stood, stripped of every last shred of dignity on their first hour in that camp. She had never forgotten his face, though he clearly did not remember hers. To him she was only a woman in the audience who had spoken well about grace, and he wanted to thank her. He told her he had become a Christian since the war. He told her he knew God had forgiven him for the cruelty of those days, cruelty he did not deny and did not excuse, but that he needed, he said, to hear the words from the lips of someone who had actually been there, someone who had actually suffered what he had helped to inflict. And then he put out his hand. Corrie stood with her own hand at her side and could not lift it. She would say later that it felt physically impossible, as though her arm belonged to someone else. Every image of Betsy's dying body, every hour of that shower room, every ounce of what this man's uniform had meant to her, rose up in that instant between them, and forgiveness, which she had preached about not 20 minutes before, with total conviction, suddenly felt like the one thing in the world she was not able to do. She had told the crowd that Jesus commanded forgiveness. She believed it with her whole mind, and her arm would not move. She prayed, not eloquently, not even, she admitted, faithfully, something closer to a plea flung upward without confidence it would be answered. Jesus, help me. I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness. And in the space of that prayer, something happened that Corrie ten Boom would describe for the rest of her life as the truest proof she ever had that forgiveness is not a feeling manufactured by willpower, but a gift handed down from outside the self entirely. She felt warmth begin in her shoulder. She was specific about this detail every time she told it, because it had astonished her that much. A current moving down through her arm and into her hand, and her hand rose to meet his, and as their palms met she heard herself say the words before she had decided to say them. "I forgive you, brother, with all my heart." She meant it. That was the part that undid her most, telling it afterward. Not that she had managed some gritted teeth act of moral discipline, but that in the instant her hand met his, the hatred that had been sitting in her chest for 3 years simply was not there anymore. Something had moved through her that she had not supplied. She had asked for the will to forgive and been given, instead, the thing itself. That handshake in a Munich church became, more than any other single moment of her long ministry, the seat of everything Corrie would go on to teach about forgiveness for the next 30 years. She never again described it as a feeling. She called it an act of the will, obedience first, and emotion following after, sometimes long after, sometimes not at all in this life. But she also never again described it without that warmth flooding down her arm, because she wanted every person she ever taught to understand that the will alone does not do this work. The will opens the hand. God supplies what fills it. She would go on teaching that lesson from platforms on 6 continents, to prisoners and to the families of victims, and to ordinary congregations who had never suffered anything like what she had suffered, and needed the truth anyway. Because forgiveness was never a specialty reserved for survivors of the camps. It was, she said, the daily bread of anyone who meant to follow Christ at all. But it had a beginning, concrete and dated and witnessed, in a church basement in post-war Munich, where a woman who had walked out of Ravensbrück alive by an accident of paperwork discovered that the freedom she had been given at the gate was only the outer freedom. The inner one, the freedom from the poison of an old hatred, had to be received separately, on a different day, with her hand already extended before she understood what it would cost her and what it would give back. In church halls and prison chapels, and college gymnasiums and army barracks turned overnight into meeting rooms, Tante Corrie carried the same small square of cloth for nearly 40 years. She kept it folded in her handbag the way another woman might carry a photograph. When the moment came, and she always knew the moment, she would hold it up first with the back turned toward the crowd. The reverse side was a mess, threads crossed and doubled back on themselves, knots bunched where a hand had tied off a color it no longer needed. No shape, no sense, nothing a stranger could name. She let the room sit with that side long enough to feel its confusion. Then she turned the square around. On the front, worked in gold and purple thread, was a crown. It was an old device, older than Corrie herself, the piece of embroidery paired for generations with a poem that begins, "My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I do not choose the colors, he worketh steadily." She had not invented the illustration. She had simply carried it further than anyone before her, into more rooms, before more faces marked by more different griefs, until it became inseparable from her name. Ravensbrück was on that reverse side. So was Vatt, and the transport that took Betsy, and the 10 months of watching her sister die a slow yard at a time on a wooden bunk. So was every knot Corrie herself could not explain, why she had lived and Betsy had not, why the mix-up with her paperwork had let her walk out the gate a free woman days before the other women her age were sent to the gas. She never pretended the tangle was pretty. She held it up first, every time, because she would not let anyone accuse her of skipping the hard side to reach the crown. But she always turned the cloth over. That was the discipline, not the knowledge that a crown existed somewhere in the weave, but the willingness to turn the fabric around in front of strangers and let them see it too. Only the weaver, she would say, works from the top side. The rest of us live on the underside of our own lives, and the pattern is not ours to read until it is finished. She had not planned to spend the remainder of her life doing this. In May of 1945, walking out of the camp system that had swallowed her sister and very nearly swallowed her, Corrie ten Boom was 53 years old, with no husband, no children, a father dead in prison, a home in Haarlem she was not yet certain she could bear to re-enter, and no plan beyond Betsy's dying instruction that they must tell people there was no pit so deep that God was not deeper still. She kept that instruction the way another woman keeps a letter from someone she has lost. And then, astonishingly, she kept walking with it, not for a season, but for the rest of her natural life, across more than 60 countries, for the better part of 33 years. She called herself, in the title of one of her own books, a tramp for the Lord. It was not false modesty. After the war she owned almost nothing that could not fit in a single suitcase. She slept in guest rooms and mission houses and the spare beds of people she had met only days before. She crossed oceans on tickets bought by churches too small to know what they were setting loose. She stood in pulpits in West Germany within 2 years of the surrender, addressing congregations that included men who had worn the uniform she had watched murder women at evening roll call, and she stood in synagogues and Israeli meeting halls telling Jewish audiences what her father Caspar had taught her about God's ancient people before either of them had ever heard the word Ravensbrück. She spoke through interpreters in languages she never learned to read. She lost track, by her own admission, of how many times she told the story of the room behind the wall, until she sometimes had to be reminded which country she was in. The traveling itself was a discipline before the speaking ever began. She was in her 50s, then her 60s, then her 70s, moving through airports and rail platforms with a suitcase and a Bible and that small woven cloth, sleeping wherever hospitality opened a door, eating whatever a stranger's kitchen produced, adjusting to a dozen different beds in a single month. She had built her whole first life inside the walls of the Beige, in one house on one street in one city, surrounded by the same three faces at the same supper table for 50 years. God's second calling on her life asked her to give up every fixed thing that first life had given her, and to do it not for a decade, but for the remainder of her days. She did not complain about it in what she wrote. She noted instead, with the plain gratitude that marks everything she set down on paper, that wherever she went someone was waiting to receive her, and that this too was the hand of the God who had never once let her go hungry in a cell or unheard in a barracks. It was in this itinerant life, and not in the camps themselves, that the discipline of forgiveness took its final shape. The camps had taught her the doctrine. Munich, in 1947, had put the doctrine to its first hard test, when a man who had guarded her at Ravensbrück came forward at the end of a meeting with his hand out, asking for the forgiveness she had just finished preaching, and she had to raise her own hand, though every part of her body resisted the motion. That morning belongs to an earlier telling of her story. What belongs here is what came after. The fact that Munich was not the last test, but the first of 1,000, repeated in 1,000 different rooms, none of them announced in advance, none of them offering the tidy drama of a former guard walking down a church aisle. Forgiveness, she said again and again in the decades that followed, was not a feeling. It was an act of the will. A person does not wait to feel like forgiving any more than a soldier waits to feel like standing at his post. The will chooses, and the feeling, if it comes at all, follows afterward, sometimes by hours, sometimes by years. She taught this to Christians who wanted forgiveness to arrive as a wave of warmth washing away the wound in a single stroke, and she corrected them gently every time. It rarely came that way for her either. It came as a decision made once in Munich and then made again the following week, and the week after that, against smaller and stranger provocations that never made it into any book. A fellow worker's carelessness, a host family's thoughtless remark, the ordinary friction of a woman past 60 living for months at a time in other people's houses, dependent on other people's patience, sometimes trying that patience past its limit. Bitterness did not announce itself only in the form of a Nazi uniform. It came dressed as fatigue, as homesickness, as the small cruelties travelers absorb from strangers who do not know what they are dealing with. She forgave those too, and taught audiences to do the same, because she understood, better than most who have written on the subject, that the discipline is worthless if it only works on the extraordinary case. A faith that can forgive Ravensbrück but not a rude remark at breakfast has not yet learned anything durable. She carried this teaching into rooms where it cost her something different each time. To German audiences she offered forgiveness as a gift she herself had been required to extend, refusing every temptation to let her listeners believe that because she had suffered, she stood above them and could grant them absolution from a height. She insisted the opposite, that she had needed forgiving too, for the bitterness that had risen in her own heart at the very moment she raised her hand to that guard, and that grace had reached her exactly there, in the second before her will gave way. To Jewish audiences, and later at Yad Vashem itself, she offered something that looked from the outside like solidarity but felt from the inside like inheritance, her father's love for the Jewish people, worn into her own bones since childhood at the Beja, finally finding its full expression not in hiding a family in an attic but in standing, decades later, in front of the descendants of the people Caspar had loved, and telling them plainly that they had never been alone. That inheritance was formally recognized in 1967, when Yad Vashem in Jerusalem named Cornelia ten Boom among the righteous among the nations, the honor set aside for Gentiles who had risked their own lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. She traveled to Israel to receive it, and to plant a tree along the avenue of the righteous, her name set beside those of the very few who had done what the ten Boom family had done without calculating the cost first. It would have been easy, standing in that avenue, to let the honor become a monument to a single dramatic season of her life, the room behind the wall, the false wall itself, the 6 people who lived those months inside her father's house, waiting for a knock that eventually came. But Corrie did not receive the honor as a monument. She received it as confirmation of something Caspar had taught her before she was old enough to understand what it would ask of her, that the Jewish people were, as her father used to say, the apple of God's eye, and that love for them was not a wartime exception to ordinary faith, but the ordinary shape faith was always supposed to take. The tree planted in Jerusalem in 1967, and the girl learning to love her Jewish neighbors at her father's knee in the 1890s were, in the tapestry's terms, the same thread pulled the same direction across 70 years. What looked to the world like heroism looked to Corrie like inheritance honored, nothing more and nothing less than a daughter finishing what her father had begun. The honor did not change how she traveled or what she carried in her handbag. She kept using the same small woven crown, kept turning it front to back for audiences who had never heard of Ravensbrück and would not have known the name Yad Vashem if she had not told them. She kept insisting, in venue after venue across decade after decade, that forgiveness was work rather than mood, obedience rather than mood's residue, and that the same God who had proven himself deeper than the deepest pit was equally present in the small, unglamorous provocations of an ordinary Tuesday. She had learned this on the floor of a barracks watching her sister die. She went on relearning it, in smaller and stranger doses, in 100 guest bedrooms in 100 countries, for the rest of her natural life. The discipline she carried into every room was never a performance built for a stage. It was the same choice, made again and again, until it had worn itself into the only shape her character had left to offer. Steady, plain, unspectacular in the retelling, and for that very reason, unmistakably real. She would have said, if asked, that none of it was remarkable. The remarkable part, she always insisted, belonged to the weaver and not the thread. But those who sat in the rooms she entered, in Munich and Jerusalem, in 100 towns whose names she herself sometimes forgot, came away certain they had witnessed something they would carry the rest of their lives. A woman past 60, past 70, past the age when most people stop being asked to prove anything, turning a small embroidered crown over in her hands and insisting, with the plain conviction of someone who had tested it in the worst possible conditions and found it true, that the tangled underside was never the whole story, and that Jesus was, in the end, still and always victor. The manuscript sat in boxes for months before anyone believed it was a book. Tante Corrie had told the story so many times from platforms, in Dutch church halls, in American living rooms, to college students who wept without knowing why, that the words had worn smooth as river stones. But spoken words evaporate. John and Elizabeth Sherrill, the writers who would shape those stories into pages, sat with her for long sessions in the early months of 1971, asking the questions an audience never thinks to ask. What did the concrete floor of Scheveningen feel like against bare feet in January? What Betsy said when the fleas would not stop biting? Corrie answered plainly, the way she always answered, no embellishment needed, because the truth needed none. The hiding place appeared that year under the Sherrill's careful hand and Tante Corrie's unmistakable voice, and it did what no lecture tour, however long, could do. It went where she could not follow. It sat on nightstands in Ohio and hospital waiting rooms in Manila, and prison libraries in places that would never have let her through the gate. A book does not tire. A book does not need a translator standing beside it, and yet in over 60 languages one stood anyway, carrying her sentences into households she would never see. She had been writing long before that, in a smaller way, devotional pieces, articles for mission magazines, the kind of modest prose that circulates in church basements and gets passed hand to hand until the paper softens. But the hiding place changed the shape of things. It made her, almost overnight and at the age of 79, one of the most recognized Christian voices in the English-speaking world. And true to the woman the Bajad raised, she did not slow down to enjoy it. She kept traveling, she kept speaking, and she kept writing, because writing was simply another room in the house of obedience, Tramp for the Lord, which told what happened after liberation, the years of the world tour that never really ended. In my father's house, reaching back to fill in what the hiding place had left for later, the childhood at the Biege, Caspar ten Boom's gentle authority, the watch shop's slow rhythms, each new day and not good if detached, and a shelf of others, devotionals mostly, short reflections meant to be read one morning at a time by ordinary believers trying to survive ordinary days. She wrote the way she had always lived, without waste, without decoration, every sentence built to carry weight rather than display it. It was Billy Graham's film company, Worldwide Pictures, that brought The Hiding Place to the screen in 1975, and Tante Corrie, by then 83, involved herself in the production with the same directness she brought to everything. Jeanette Clift played Corrie. Julie Harris played Betsy, bringing to the screen a face luminous enough to carry Betsy's radiance to millions who had never read a page of the book. Tante Corrie visited the set. She met the actors, She watched them rebuild the Beiji's secret room in a studio, plywood and lath standing in for 80-year-old brick, and by every account it moved her to see the crisis, hers and Betsy's and the family's, reconstructed by strangers who had studied it as carefully as scholars study scripture, trying to get it right because they understood, somehow, that this was not simply a war story. The film released to theaters and then to churches, to youth groups, to countless living rooms once home video made it portable. And it did for the eye what the book had done for the mind. It let people who would never sit in a lecture hall watch Betsy say, from behind barbed wire, that there is no pit so deep God is not deeper still. Millions who never learned Tante Corrie's name learned Betsy's face instead, and through it hers. By the time the film reached its widest audience, Tante Corrie had begun, quietly, to slow, not in conviction, never in conviction, but in the body that had carried her across 60 countries and more than 100 journeys since the war. She had been on the road essentially without pause for over 30 years, sleeping in a different bed most nights of most years, preaching in languages she did not speak through interpreters she had only just met. In 1977, at 85, she settled at last into a single house in Placentia, California, a modest place she and her friends called Shalom House, Peace House, as if even the name were a small sermon on what she hoped it would be. It was the first home she had kept for herself, apart from the Beiji, and longer than most of her readers had been alive. She kept working there. She answered letters. Thousands of them arrived, from readers of The Hiding Place who wanted to tell her what the book had done in their own dark rooms, and she tried, as her strength allowed, to answer as many as she could. She kept writing. She received visitors, pastors and missionaries and ordinary Christians who had crossed an ocean or a continent simply to sit across a table from the woman who had held Betsy's hand in Ravensbrück. Then, in August of 1978, the first stroke came. It took her speech, at first almost entirely, and it took much of the movement on one side of her body. For a woman whose entire ministry for 3 decades had been the spoken word, the platform, the pulpit, the interpreter at her elbow, the crowd leaning forward to catch what she would say next, this was not a small mercy withheld. It was, on the face of it, the cruelest possible silencing. The voice that had told the story of the hiding place in more countries than any other living evangelist, the voice that had said Jesus is victor to rooms full of grieving strangers, the voice that had looked a former Ravensbrück guard in the eye and offered him her hand, that voice went quiet, and it did not fully return. A second stroke followed, and then more after that. Over the years that remained to her, each one taking a little more, she lost most of her ability to speak coherently. She lost the ability to write. She lost in time much of her ability to move on her own at all. She lived like this for nearly 5 years. It would be easy, telling the story quickly, to rush past those years as a kind of coda, the great life essentially finished, the remaining time a postscript before the final page. But that is not how the people who cared for her in Shalom House remember it, and it is not how the story ought to be told, because those years were not empty. They were simply quiet, in a way nothing in her life had ever been quiet before. Pam Rosewell, the young Englishwoman who had traveled with Tante Corrie for years and who now became her companion and caretaker through the long silence, watched her closely during that time and later gave the world a record of it. 5 silent years, she called her account, and the title alone tells you what those years asked of everyone who loved her. Tante Corrie could not tell them any longer what the silence meant to her, what it cost, what she still believed while trapped inside a body that would no longer carry her convictions into speech. She could only be present, and it turned out that presence, even stripped of every word, was not nothing. Visitors still came to Shalom House during those years, fewer than before, because word had spread that Tante Corrie could no longer speak, but some still came, unable to stay away from a woman who had shaped their faith from a distance and wanted, before it was too late, to sit in the same room with her once. They found her in a wheelchair most days, her face marked by the strokes, her words gone or garbled beyond understanding. And they found, again and again, that something in the room still ministered to them anyway. Pam Rosewell recorded moments when Tante Corrie's eyes would fill with recognition at a hymn, or when her good hand would reach for a visitor's hand the way it had reached for so many hands across 60 years, holding on with whatever strength remained in fingers that could no longer write letters or turn book pages. She could not preach forgiveness any longer with her mouth. She simply continued to be a woman who had forgiven, sitting quietly in a chair, and that turned out to be its own unmistakable sermon, perhaps the plainest one she ever gave, stripped of every tool she had once used to deliver it. No stage, no interpreter, no crowd. Only a face that had survived Ravensbrück and years afterward still telling the truth, wordlessly, that the God who had been deeper than that pit was deeper still than this one. There is something almost unbearably fitting in this, for those who knew her whole story, though it would be wrong to call it anything but hard. The woman who had spent decades insisting that Jesus is victor, that no darkness could reach the hiding place God provided, that forgiveness was a discipline of the will, rather than a feeling to be waited for. That woman now lived out the hardest test of all those convictions, in a body that offered her no platform to declare them anymore. She had told rooms full of strangers, standing under stage lights, with an interpreter at her side, that there is no pit too deep for God's love. Now she was asked to believe it without being able to say so, in a wheelchair, in a quiet California house, day after day, for years. If the discipline of forgiveness had been the great teaching she carried into every room across the second half of her life, this final silence was where that discipline was proved beyond all argument, not in a lecture, but in a life. She could not perform faith any longer. She could only have it, or not, in the stillness where no one was watching but God, and the handful of people who loved her enough to keep sitting beside the chair. The end came on April 15th, 1983. It was her 91st birthday. Anyone who has sat inside the Jewish tradition that shaped so much of what Caspar ten Boom taught his children at the Beis table will recognize what that date means. Within that tradition, to die on one's own birthday is counted a mark of special favor, a life completed, not merely ended, the circle closing exactly where it began. It is not a claim this book invents. It is simply a fact of the calendar, and a truth the tradition has long treasured about the righteous. And it settles over Tante Corrie's death, like a benediction nobody arranged. She who had loved the Jewish people with the whole weight of her life, who had risked the Beji, and her family, and her own body to hide them, who had accepted the righteous among the nations honor from Yad Vashem in 1967, with the same plain gratitude she brought to everything, passed from this world on the one day of the year the ancient tradition marks as evidence of a life lived in full favor before God. Nobody planned that. It simply happened. The way so much of her story simply happened, with a timing too precise to be coincidence and too quiet to be showmanship. It was, in the end, exactly like her. Understated, unmistakable, and entirely beyond dispute once you saw it plainly. She was buried without fanfare, as she would have wanted, in the country that had become her final home. But the books did not stop working after the funeral, and the film did not stop playing in church basements and living rooms, and the letters did not stop arriving at addresses that no longer had anyone to open them, forwarded on to friends who tried to answer in her place. A voice silenced by stroke in 1978 was, by then, already speaking in 60 languages through pages that did not need a throat to carry them. That is the strange mercy hidden inside those 5 hard years of silence. By the time the silence came, she had already given the world enough words to outlast her, the hiding place open on a nightstand in a country she'd visited once and would never see again, a film reel turning in a church she had never entered, a devotional read aloud that morning by someone who had never heard her voice and never would, and yet somehow heard it anyway. The woman could no longer speak. What she had already spoken had learned to speak for itself, and it has not stopped since. The door is still there. Bartoljorisstraat 19, Haarlem, a narrow wooden door beside the watch shop window, painted the same blue-green it has worn for 100 years, with a worn stone step below it dipped in the middle from 3 centuries of feet. Above it hangs a small bell that rang for customers coming to have a watch repaired, for neighbors coming to borrow flour, for policemen coming to check papers, and, in the years this book has tried to hold at arm's length long enough to see whole, for refugees coming in the dark with nowhere else to go. Today it rings for tourists. They come from Seoul and São Paulo and Springfield, Missouri, queue on the narrow street, duck their heads under the low lintel the way Caspar ten Boom's customers always had to, and stand in the front hallway where a watchmaker once welcomed the whole world in for the price of a smile. You have been standing at that door for 8 chapters now. You have heard the bell ring for a beggar woman and a hand held out. You have sat at the family table under Tante Jance's disapproving eye and Caspar's blessing. You have watched a house say yes before it understood the cost, watched a young woman with more grief in her than most people carry in a lifetime become the first licensed female watchmaker in Holland out of sheer bruised stubbornness. You have crouched behind a false wall while Boots came up the stairs. You have watched a sister choose gratitude in a room full of fleas and grief, and thereby saved more lives than either of them would ever know. You have walked free through a gate that should have closed on you forever, and traveled the world for 30 years afterward, learning, then teaching, then simply living the hardest word in the Christian faith. You have sat with an old woman in her 90s still praying by the fire for people whose names she could no longer speak, but had never stopped loving. That has been the introduction. What you are holding is the doorway, not the house. The house is 3 volumes deep, and every room in it is worth the walk. The first room is the one that made her, before the war, before the room behind the wall, before any of it, when Corrie ten Boom was simply Casper's youngest daughter, growing up above a watch shop on a street too narrow for 2 bicycles to pass. The watchmaker's daughter takes you there and does not rush you through it, because nothing about that house was rushed. You will meet Casper ten Boom properly, not as the martyr's father he became, but as the man he was, for 60 years before that, gentle to the point of foolishness with his customers, unable to turn away a debt he knew would never be repaid, a man who prayed each morning as if the day's mail might contain instructions from God himself, because as far as he was concerned it sometimes did. You will meet Betsy as a girl, frail from birth, gifted with a kind of seeing that made ordinary rooms luminous, already practicing the discipline of thanksgiving that would one day keep her alive in hell longer than her body had any right to manage. You will meet Nolly, warm and practical and unafraid. Willem, already troubled by what he saw brewing in Germany years before anyone else in Holland wanted to look. Tante Jans, difficult and devout and dying well, teaching Corrie by her deathbed that faith is not a performance for company. You will read about the Alpina watches Casper repaired with a jeweler's loop screwed into one eye for 40 years, about the family's strange and steadfast custom of praying by name for the Jewish people of Israel, decades before the world would ask what that love had cost them, about a childhood built room by room on the conviction that every guest at the door, Jew or Gentile, beggar or baron, was Christ himself knocking. This is the volume where you learn why the hiding place, when it came, was never really a decision. The house had been built to say yes 100 years before the wall went up. The watchmaker's daughter shows you the soil, so that nothing which grows out of it later ever surprises you again. The second room is the one this whole book has circled but never fully entered, because some rooms cannot be visited in passing. No pit so deep as the war, all of it, not softened, not summarized. It is May 1942, a trembling woman at the door with a suitcase, and Corrie's own hand reaching for it before her mind had finished deciding. It is the workman who built the false wall in her bedroom in one night, the buzzer wired into the stairwell, the ration cards forged at a kitchen table by a resistance man named Pickwick, who came and went like a shadow. It is the reality, never flinched from, that this quiet, respectable elderly family ran an underground operation for 2 years, out of a house too small to hide anything, and that it worked because God multiplied their courage, the way he once multiplied loaves. And it is February 28th, 1944, the betrayal, the raid, the long terrible day when the Beji filled with Gestapo, and 6 people held their breath behind a wall, 18 inches deep, while the house was torn apart around them. No pit so deep does not let you look away from what came after. Scheveningen prison, where Corrie lay alone and ill, and where Casper ten Boom, 84 years old, died within 10 days of his arrest, faithful to the end, having told his interrogator that it would be an honor to give his life for God's ancient people. Vought, the barracks, the roll calls, the freight train to Ravensbrück, 90-some women crammed into a cattle car for days, and then the camp itself, where the volume does not spare you the lice, the starvation, the cruelty of guards who had stopped believing the women in front of them were fully human. It gives you Betsy in that barracks, dying by degrees and somehow growing more luminous as her body failed, speaking the words that would become the hinge of everything that came after, that there is no pit so deep that God is not deeper still, that after the war they must tell people what they had learned, that God will use them to be that hiding place for others once they are free. She died on December 16th, 1944, and this volume will not let that death be tidy or quick, because it was not, and Tante Corrie herself never asked anyone to pretend otherwise. It gives you the clerical error that released Corrie a week before every other woman her age in that barracks was sent to the gas chamber, a mistake, the record-keeper's slip, and Corrie ten Boom lived the rest of her life calling it nothing of the kind. No Pit So Deep is the hardest of the 3 books to read. It is also, read rightly, the one that will do the most for a reader who is standing at the edge of their own pit tonight and wondering if anyone has ever gone down that far and come back still believing. The third room is the one where the message that cost so much finally reached the world it was meant for, and Tramp for the Lord is its record. This is Corrie in her 50s, alone, no formal training, stepping off a plane in a country whose language she barely spoke, carrying a suitcase and a message about a savior who is victor over the very worst thing that can be done to a human being. Over the next 3 decades, she would cross the ocean literally by tramp steamer more than once, count more than 60 countries, sleep in guest rooms and prison cells, and once, memorably, an actual jail, and never once complained that the ministry God had given a spinster watchmaker from Harlem looked nothing like what she might have planned for herself. This is the volume that holds the encounter in Munich in 1947 that this book has already told you was the hinge of her whole teaching on forgiveness, but Tramp for the Lord gives you the fuller life around that one afternoon, the years of practicing what she had learned there, teaching it not as sentiment but as obedience, an act of the will performed before the feeling ever arrived, tested and retested in 100 rooms with 100 different faces looking back at her, some of them the faces of people whose countries had done the killing. It is the volume where Yad Vashem names her righteous among the nations in 1967 and plants a tree in Jerusalem in her honor, and where she stands in that avenue of trees and understands it as the fruit of a love her father had planted in her as a girl decades before either of them knew what it would cost. It gives you her later years too, the strokes, the slowing body, the small house in California where she still received visitors and still prayed for people by name until she no longer had the words to do it aloud, dying finally on April 15th, 1983, her 91st birthday, a detail so fitting that no one who has read her life could ever call it coincidence. Tramp for the Lord is the volume that answers the question every reader eventually asks about a story like this one. What do you do once you have survived it? You give it away. That is the whole of the answer, and that whole book is the long, faithful, unglamorous, occasionally hilarious record of her doing exactly that. 3 volumes. A girl in the house that made her, a woman in the war that tried to break her and could not reach what mattered most, a tramp for the Lord who carried what she had learned to every corner of the earth she could reach before her strength ran out. Read in order, they are one life. Read separately, each one stands complete, because Tante Corrie's story was never really about escalation towards some final triumphant scene. It was about the same faithfulness proven true in 100 different rooms, the watch shop and the hiding place and the airport terminal, all built on the identical foundation. That is, in the end, the real reason to read all 3, not because the story gets bigger, because you get to watch the same unshakable thing, Jesus is victor, spoken first as a child's simple confidence and tested finally as an old woman's settled certainty, hold, every single time, under every kind of weight the world can bring against it. If you have never read a word of Tante Corrie's own writing, this is the moment to go find it. She wrote in her own voice, plain, warm, often funny, never self-pitying, and there is no substitute for hearing her tell you herself about the fleas in that barracks, or the watch her father let her fix for the first time, or the particular quality of the silence in the room the night the Gestapo finally left the beige and 6 trembling people behind a false wall began, at last, to breathe. Whatever this book has given you of her, her own words will give you more, because she was, before she was anything else the world came to call her, a woman who knew how to tell the truth about a hard thing without letting the hardness have the last word. And if this book is the first time you have ever heard her name, then welcome. You are standing exactly where a beggar woman once stood, where a trembling refugee once stood, where thousands of frightened and searching people have stood at that narrow blue-green door on Barteljorastraat for 100 years, at a threshold, uncertain, wondering if it is safe to knock. It is. It always was. The house behind that door was built on nothing grander than the conviction that God is faithful, and that his people, however ordinary, however afraid, are called to answer the door when he knocks in the shape of someone else's need. That is the whole of what Tante Corrie ever asked anyone to believe, and it is enough to build a life on, because she built hers on nothing more, and found it held. The Lord is my hiding place, the psalmist wrote, long before there was a beige or a false wall or a woman named Betsy to teach the world what those words could cost and what they could hold. Corrie ten Boom did not invent that shelter. She only proved, in the deepest pit the last century built, that it was real, and deep enough, and would not fail. The door is open. Go on in.